The very first funeral I ever did was for a frog. I was 7 years old, I was at summer camp, and my cabin mates and I, we found this frog, and his leg was hurt, and he was hobbling around, and we knew it was his last day. We named him Spot, and we did our best to revive him, but I guess it was just his time. So we tied a few sticks together, and we sent him off into the lake, and we sang, "Day is done, gone the sun, from the lake, from the hills, from the sky. All is well, safely rest, God is nigh." It was a beautiful service. The first wedding I ever did was for a pair of parakeets. We were bird sitting. You could see where I was headed. The service was short and chirpy, and I was probably more excited about it than they were. The first tragedy I ever really recall was watching in horror as my cat ate my bird. I'm serious. And the first real-life mystery that I remember was when our snakes escaped in our house, only to be found several years later. And my first encounter with the absurd was when my mom let us keep this rabbit we were gifted, and she went out and bought all of this bells and whistles, everything it needed, only to find out a couple hours later that night that we were all allergic, and she had to return everything. You could say that I grew up in my very own national zoo, if you will. Anyway, but the point is, for so many of us, some of these precious life firsts can come in our interactions with animals, right? They're often early windows into unconditional love or real responsibility, painful loss, mutual caring and affection. They also help us open our eyes to the simple, wondrous truth that we are part of a larger global family, one that we are called to recognize and called to nurture. Truth be told, pets can expand our hearts. They remind us that we can have room and compassion for others, even for the stranger. Dare I say, sometimes even for the despised. Now, Jesus had a flair for the dramatic, especially if it helped to prove a point. We can imagine him telling today's parable huddled around a late-night campfire, everybody leaning in with their s'mores, right? To give some context, back in Jesus' day, wealth and prosperity were synonymous with being in God's good graces. And poverty meant, well, you must have missed the mark somewhere. So Jesus' listeners had no idea where this story would be headed. Jesus introduces us to this rich man, and he wears fine linens, and he lives in a house that's safely locked behind a gate. And outside his gate, there is a poor man who is so demeaned and devalued by society that the only souls that are willing to touch him are the dogs. But Jesus gives this poor man something very significant: a name, Lazarus. And names in the Bible, they matter. In fact, Jesus doesn't give anyone else in any other parable a name. But he gives this man a name, and his name means God's help. And by giving him a name, he gives him some humanity, right? He gives him some dignity. When Lazarus dies, he has no funeral. Instead, angels carry him to one of the holiest places in Jewish thinking, Abraham's bosom. When the rich man dies, although he gets this proper funeral, he is sent to Hades. It's sort of like limbo, where he's tormented. Pretty intense stuff, right? In Hades, the rich man calls upon Abraham to tell Lazarus to give him some water, but Abraham says, "No way." Finally, the rich man says, "Well, at least warn my brothers so that they can make different choices than I did." And Abraham replies, Your brothers should know better. They have Moses and the prophets. They know the morals of their faith. Free those who are wrongfully imprisoned. Lighten the burden of those who work for you. Let the oppressed go free and remove the chains that bind them. Remember that you too were strangers in the land. If your brothers don't believe this in their bones, what more can I say or do? And this is where Jesus' point really hits home. This isn't a story about a rich man. This isn't a story about Lazarus. This is a story about us. And we are the brothers. We are the brothers. Jesus is saying that as children of Abraham, children of God, we must live with eyes open and hearts open to all of God's creation, right here, right now. There is an urgency in this story. In today's world, we know that there are glimpses of Lazarus at every turn. But far too often we miss or ignore those in need of compassion or care. Maybe we're driving or walking or moving too fast. We're rushing to that meeting or that team practice, even hurrying to come here today. I mean, we start at 10. 10 people. We start at 10. But what this parable is trying to teach us, even though I'm going to regret this later, is to slow our pace. We must take the time to recognize where there is suffering and where there is injustice and expand our hearts wide and lead with kindness, this kindness we speak of every week, to truly see ourselves as a beloved part of a larger story. I wonder what would happen if we really make every step we take more intentional. Would we finally make eye contact with the person holding a sign asking for spare change? Would we notice the wounded deer on the side of the road needing tending to? Would we accompany that classmate that always walks home alone? Would we pick up the pieces of trash we see along the sidewalk? Would we stop to hear the perspective of a protester with whom we disagree? Would we take the time to meet that neighbor we've said only 2 words to? Would we play with our pet, pushing the ball toward us? Would we even be more thoughtful in our fasting and reflecting this Yom Kippur? Today, as we celebrate the Christian holiday called the Feast of St. Francis and the blessing of the animals, we remember that St. Francis was a man who grew up wealthy and comfortable, much like the rich man in our story, but he left everything behind in order to serve the poor and care for animals and nature. He nurtured people suffering with leprosy. These are folks people didn't even want to get close to. And he even was said to preach to the birds, which I could really resonate. He certainly took Jesus' parable to heart. And instead of staying behind those safety of those closed gates, he let them swing open so he could see and celebrate the dignity and divinity of every living thing. And so too are we, charged to do the same, each in our own unique way. I don't know about you guys, but the world is so hard to look at sometimes. And I would rather shut my eyes and pull the cover over my head. But today's message is clear. We can't. As people of faith, as people of faiths, we know what we have to do, and we have to get to it. We are called to get out the door, to step into vulnerable spaces, to stay awake and aware of the news. We have to speak out loud when there is suffering and injustice. We have to work for reconciliation. We have to show up for one another, for our endangered planet, for the animals in need of a home, for children yearning for a safe place to grow up. We have to recognize our capacity to reach out beyond the gate and then way, way beyond our comfort zones. To let our empathy be what fires us up, knowing there is a need, perhaps more than ever, for brave, big-hearted, compassionate leadership right here, right now. After all, we are a part of God's interfaith, interspecies, interconnected, global family. And just like animals teach us much about radical acceptance and kindness, we too are called to nurture and care for the most vulnerable in our midst and those far away. Friends, with God's help, may we have the courage to live with eyes open and hearts expanded and feet willing to come close enough to finally see each other as beloved. Amen.